These are the Chat City interviews from 103.2 Preston FM.
And now, time to welcome my guests into the studio. It's lovely to welcome Heather again, Heather Crook and Steve Halliwell. So a very good morning to you both.
Good morning.
It's funny, I don't need a diary. I just wait for you two to appear at the door and I know another month has gone by. So lovely to see you, but hard to believe it's now the end of June. And the way we're going, you'll soon be coming back in the dark days. So lovely to meet you. And of course, for those who don't know, Heather is the lady who puts together the magazines. That's Preston Magazine, Penwether Magazine and Lostock Magazine. And Steve is the man behind the history of the pubs here in Preston and has just published a book about the pubs in Preston, and will be signing copies at Waterstones in Preston a week tomorrow. So we'll be talking to Steve quite soon. But Heather, a very good morning to you.
Good morning.
And coming out soon, I think, is it Preston Magazine, the one that you're going to be?
It's out early next week.
And again, for people who don't know, you need to read these magazines. There's some fantastic stories that people have often submitted to do with history and to do with their own families and their own recollections. And recently there's been quite a number of submissions to do with World War One.
Yeah, there has, yeah. I've been running a diary of James Green, and that's really interesting.
And many other things. And the one that I've got in my hand is the Lostock magazine, issue 15. That one is out now, is it?
That one's out now, yes.
And I was just looking at this. I just love the stories in these magazines. And this one is from the 1940s. And it's an elephant story. And it's the memoirs of Bernard Billington, and written by Tony Billington. And apparently in the late 1940s, an incident occurred at Preston railway station which subsequently involved the tannery at Lostock Hall. And apparently what happened was that a circus arrived at Preston railway station, and it was travelling the country, but when it got to Preston, I don't know if it was anything to do personally with Preston that the elephant didn't like, but apparently they were in the process of moving the elephant to the sidings and back onto the main track when the elephant became very agitated, and it proceeded to make a mess of its cage and was threatening to run amok. It is believed the local vet was called for, but the equipment he had proved inadequate, so they then called out the soldiers from Fulwood Barracks who arrived. It was the Royal Artillery who arrived with rifles, and it's quite possible that they were placed in a coal wagon and shunted down the next track adjacent to the Mayhem, where the duly dispatched the far from happy jumbo elephant. So you just couldn't make these stories up, could you? But hopefully the end of the story, I think, is quite happy. I've not actually read the end of it, but I think they eventually calmed the elephant down. And that was here in the 1940s in Preston. So you can find out about that by reading the Lostock magazine, and lots of other information, one about train spotting around Lostock, etc. But also, whilst Heather's with us, as she has been doing on each of her visits, she's now going to read the memoirs of her father, who was Arthur Eric Crook, and a Preston lad. So here's Heather and a Preston lad.
Right. Now, at the moment, he's staying in Leyland at a gentleman's house who used to be a lodger when he lived with his foster mum at Bamber Bridge. It says, when dinner was over, Mr. Thornley had another surprise for me. He told Kath to go with Walter to his girl's house and stay to tea. It didn't suit her, but off they both went. Out came her granddad's bike, and I was placed on the crossbar. He cocked his leg over, and off we went, with the dog running behind. I have never mentioned the dog, a red setter, but it wasn't keen on going with children. It preferred to stay with the menfolk. Kathleen and I had taken it on Saturday morning, but it kept looking behind for its master, and finally trotted back home. I felt sorry for it, with its tongue lolling out and panting, but she kept up with us just behind the back wheel. It was evident she had done this many times before. Mr. Thornley told me we were going to Bamber Bridge, where we used to live, to see the old neighbours again. I think he made the journey quite often and liked to keep in touch. It took about 20 minutes. It didn't go fast on account of the dog. By the time we arrived, my iron seat was making my bum ache. He lifted me down, leaving the bike at the top end of the row, and walked down, knocking on certain doors. When they answered, he said, "Hi, Jem, I brought someone to see thee, your missus as well. Dost thou know this young fella?" Then the no's, e's and by guns would start. "Tha's made a big un, Arthur." I was always called Arthur when I lived in the row. The Dixon girls cried and kissed me, and I nearly finished up crying myself. "We think about you many a time. Thou wert a bonny babby." All in all, we spent a good 2 hours recounting things I and they did 4 to 10 years ago. A rather nostalgic moment when the occupants of number 9 let me look round my old home. I was heartbroken and let it show. All the years had fallen away and it all came back to me. The tenant was a young man who had lived with his parents higher up the street and asked for the tenancy when we had left. He got married and fetched his bride to number 9. They had a little girl about 3. I think her name was Lucy. Another ride into Bamber Bridge itself to see a shopkeeper Mother Brown had been friendly with. I was duly shown off to her and asked all the questions my old neighbours had asked as well. Where's all them lovely curls?" It was a prison crop style you got where I was now living. Then half a crown, a princely sum, was pressed into my hand, and off we went back to Leyland for tea. Straight after we had eaten, Mr. Thornley said, "Come on, lad, get the cap and coat on, we're off again." We crossed the road to the bus stop, and in a few minutes along came a bus, destination Chorley. My companion booked 1.5 return, and we sat back on the slatted seats. I was allowed to sit next to the window. As we left Leyland behind, we passed fields with cattle grazing and resting, chewing their cud. I never saw any sheep. A farm or two, one with a bevy of kids sat on the gate, waving madly at all and sundry. Under a bridge with a train speeding over it, I surely was having an adventurous time. When I queried where we were going, all I got was a laconic, "Thou'll see." Arriving at Chorley, we disembarked only to board another bus. This time we booked to Eves Lane. It was a much shorter ride. We got off near some big gates, and to my surprise we passed through them. It was then I realised it was a hospital. Mr. Thornley spoke to a nurse, and he called her sister. I thought it must be some relation of his. It transpired that this was her title, and she was in charge. I heard her say it wasn't visiting time yet, but she would make an exception on this occasion. "You may stay for half an hour, but in future come at the proper visiting times." We went down a long passage, then entered a ward with about 20 beds, maybe a few less, but a lot nevertheless. At the very top, the last bed on the right, sat a white-haired old lady. Mr. Thornley said to her, "Hello, Esther, I've brought him." She looked at me for a long time, then sort of whispered, "Oh, Arthur, come here and let me look at you. It's been such a long time." There were tears in her eyes as she spoke, and a line of spittle seemed to cling to the corner of her mouth, and she held me with one frail arm to her breast. By now, of course, I had realised this was Mother Brown, my foster mother, who had so lovingly, in her strict fashion, looked after me in my infancy and early boyhood. She cried, I cried. Mr. Thornley's eyes looked suspiciously moist, and even the sister wiped her eyes, then left us together. "You've grown, Arthur, love. What have they done to your hair? It's a shame, my bonny lad with no curls." Although I had missed her and not seen her for years, I didn't know what to say, and let her ask the questions. I did not tell her the truth about the orphanage, the hidings, and the vitriolic tongue, just said, "It's not too bad." She asked how old I was now. "I'll be 11 on Christmas Eve," I said, and then added shyly, "Mum." "Nay, lovey, you've got that wrong. Your birthday's on the 24th of April. Miss Hall had always said Christmas Eve was my birthday. She evidently didn't know, so she picked me one. At that rate, I was already 11 and had been for about 5 weeks. Mum, as I must call her, tried to sit me on her knee, but I was too heavy, so stood in front and held her hand. "Thank you, Edward," she said to Mr. Thornley. Thank you. You have made an old lady very happy. You are so good to me. I said I would help look after her when I was big like Walter. She smiled a smile that I would now term as wistfully. All too soon it was time to go, as the patients or inmates' tea was to be served. So a rather subdued little boy of 11 left knowing that at least there was one person who loved him. I'll bring him again when I get permission, Mr. Thornley promised as we left. Another wan smile, and we had to go and leave her with her thoughts. I never saw her again, and all because of a rubber ball that changed the course of my life for the worse. The return journey back seemed to pass quicker than the outgoing one, I suppose due to me firing rapid questions at Mr. Thornley concerning Mother Brown. I incidentally had kept the surname of my natural mother. That, of course, was Crook. He explained to me about her having a stroke and the effect it has on people, and why she had difficulty with the movement of her left hand and her slightly slurred speech. Although she had been much worse in the beginning, she would never be able to look after herself, let alone a young and active boy.
There we are. Heather Crook reading from the memoirs of her father, Arthur Eric Crook, in A Preston Lad. And of course, people can read more by getting Preston Magazine, and they can find previous editions and read the full memoirs there, can't they, Heather?
Yeah.
So the Preston Magazine is out soon.
Yes, next week.
Next week, and the Lost Stock Hall magazine is out now. And again, I was just having a look through the Lost Stock Hall magazine. There's a nice photograph there on the last page, and who knows, maybe one of the guys still listening. It's Lost Stock Hall Dynamos at Mercer Road, and the picture was taken in 1966. So get a copy of the Lost Stock Hall magazine, and you might find yourself in there. So there's some fascinating stuff, isn't there? The
really
photographs are really nice to see.
Yeah, it's great where people let me put them in.
And Lost Stock Hall magazine, where can people pick that one up?
You can always get a copy at Lost Stock Hall Library, which is on Watkin Lane, and most of the shops in the area have a copy.
And then again, the Preston one, when it's out next week, people can find it
in the reference library, the library downstairs at the Harris, shops and pubs and everywhere around Preston.
And you're always looking for people to contribute. Maybe they've got stories, family history, or as we've said at the moment, you have been covering people and memoirs from the First World War.
Yeah, I'm particularly looking for any information about people on war memorials in the area, especially Penwitham and Lost Stock Hall, but also anywhere in the South Ribble or Preston.
So your contact details again, Heather?
Yeah, is 07733 321 911.
Brilliant. And as I said, Steve's with us, Steve Halliwell. So Steve, very good morning to you.
Good morning. Yeah.
So the history of Preston pubs, the book signing coming up quite soon. So it's a week tomorrow.
Week tomorrow, Saturday the 5th of July. Yes, at Waterstones.
And the times?
Noon until 2 o'clock.
And give our listeners a taster of the book. I mean, it's about, of course, the history of Preston pubs, but it also goes into the pubs themselves, doesn't it, and tell you something of the history of the pub, and I would imagine some of the characters of the pubs.
Yeah, it's the first definitive account of all the inns, taverns, beer houses that have ever existed in Preston, and there's 803, something like that. But in addition to that, I've included editorial for about 100 of those places, which includes anecdotal material, little tales about those 101.
Brilliant. And I was saying to Steve that you were in last week and we talked in more depth, didn't we, about the book that you've just written. And at the end of the show, I got a telephone call from somebody who was listening who'd heard just the end of the interview and was absolutely fascinated by the interview because of his own memories of Preston and the pubs in Preston. So if you do want to hear that interview, I think it is up on our... you can hear it back on going to Preston FM website and have a look for our podcast, and it may be up there on YouTube, so have a look for Steve Halliwell and the Preston Pubs book, and you can hear hopefully the full interview. So how's it going, the book then? Have you had contact from people maybe who've commented on it?
I've had contact from the publishers,
yeah,
and I've spoken to the people at Waterstones, and every account seems to be that there's a lot of interest in it. Yeah,
because I mean, when you think about it, it really it becomes an historical book, doesn't it? Because it's a factual book about the history of Preston.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if you've ever thought of it from that point of view, that, you know, you go down in the annals of history of writing this factual book about Preston pubs.
Well, yeah, I'm reasonably conscious of that, and I'm also conscious of the fact that there's plenty more to write about. In reality, I've probably scratched the surface in terms of the history of our licensed premises, so I'm continuing to receive new information, and you never know, there might be a volume 2.
Yes. Did you have a cut-off kind of year or date that you wrote about the pubs in this book? I mean, did you write from a date to a date?
No, it was probably a little bit of reverse and forward. What I've not included are present day pubs, many of which aren't what people of my age refer to as pubs. They're sort of young people's nightclubs in a way.
Yeah.
There are very, very few of the traditional pubs left. But initially, I did set a deadline of the beginning of the First World War. It had peaked before then. In fact, it probably peaked in about the 1880s when there were over 500 in the town, all at the same time, 542. So I set that as a late date, the beginning of the First World War. And I don't have a date for going backwards, because it really is just fortuitous if you come across information about them. So my knowledge goes back about 400 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I mean, when you think about pubs, what is sad today, I know it's mainly, well, it's not just rural. I mean, we're losing pubs weekly, aren't we? The closing pubs. But is it the character of the pubs of those days that really made them these interesting places? Because, I mean, if you go into lots of pubs these days, it's either piped music or whatever. So sometimes it's difficult to distinguish what pub you're actually in. In those days, was there entertainment in the pubs?
Oh, a lot of entertainment. Music hall, for instance, has its origins in pubs. And there were several in Preston that offered music hall entertainment. The George on Friargate had a room, a theatre, that offered or had the ability to house 1,000 people, long before the days of health and safety. It'd probably be 200 now, but in those days there were reports of 1,000 people being inside and people locked out at the same time.
Dear me.
So yeah, there's I think also each pub in those days had their own character. These days, for whatever reason, the police insist on CCTV cameras. CCTV cameras need to be able to see what needs to be seen, so walls have disappeared and we end up with just open plan buildings. And you can walk into these open plan buildings, those with memories to do so, and imagine the old walls back in place.
Yes.
And they're totally different places than they were in those days.
That's quite something, isn't it? 1,000 people, maybe there was room for. I wonder what Friday nights and Saturday nights were like there. What hours did they open? Did they kind of have strict drinking hours? Most of them?
Well, they were less. They were able to have extensions for providing there was entertainment going on. But of course, the people that were being entertained had to be up to work in the mills the following morning, so they wouldn't be late nights like we have them now. But the opening hours have changed so much over the years, and it depended where they were. The market taverns used to open at 5 in the morning, whereas they weren't the ones that were offering the music hall entertainment.
It certainly is fascinating. So it's Preston pubs and available from Waterstones and
Waterstones, the Tourist Information Office on Lancaster Road in the Guildhall. The museum are certainly going to stock them. I spoke to them earlier this week, and they've certainly got them on order. I've not checked with Halewood's yet, but I think the agent for the publisher is doing a pretty good job on having the book
on the. Well, I mean, people can come along then next Saturday to Waterstones and get the book signing, and you can hear the podcasts here on Preston FM, and you can also let the authors have our links to your podcast if you like. Stephen, get us up there on Preston FM and tell the people who come along next Saturday to the book signing they can hear you on Preston FM. What about that? So, lovely to meet you both again, and it's going to be July.
It will, yes.
It will be July. It really is hard to believe the weeks that have gone by, but thank you very much for coming in, and we look forward to the next instalment of A Preston Lad, and also hear from Steve about the book signing and any signs of the next book coming along. So a big thank you to you both.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much,
for
Rita.
having us.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed the interviews as much as we have. Why not give us a tweet at Chat City PFM?